Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Happy to have you here today for our next session of the virtual reading group, which is continuing to read this book, The Jewish Writings, Hannah Arendt, edited by Jerome Cohn and Ron Feldman. We are still in the early section of this book, reading essays that were written, the first few in Germany, and then these last few now in France, in the 1930s. So these are, we have to remember, early essays of Arendt's, also still early essays, in the history of the war. The war is just really getting going as she writes this essay, Anti-Semitism. It's 5 years after the 1933 rise to power of the Nazis and Hitler. And she's spending most of that time in Paris, going to the library, reflecting, obviously talking to a lot of other Jewish emigres, and thinking about what anti-Semitism is and what the Jewish question is. So we read two pieces today. One is a speech, The Jewish Question, and the other is a draft that breaks off midway through it, written in 1938, called Anti-Semitism. The draft of Anti-Semitism, which is the much longer piece that we read for today, if you know the origins of totalitarianism at all or well, you'll see that it is clearly much of the material in it is material that will find its way into that opening book of the origins of totalitarianism called Anti-Semitism, which is in three chapters. And this material that's in the essay Anti-Semitism is very much in a sense, I think, a first draft 12 years before the actual book is published of that material. So clearly stuff she's working on in the 30s, trying to understand, I think, what is happening to Germany, to Europe, to the Jews, and doing it in her very insightful way. But it is, we should remember, an early a draft. So about the Jewish question, the short essay that we began with today, she says, and she begins, that the Jewish world's reaction to the Jewish question is a total lack of interest in dealing with anti-Semitism. So these two essays are going to be linked. She thinks that the way the Jews have reacted to the tragedies of the 1930s is what she calls teshuvah, from the Hebrew, which was then called teshuvah, and she says it's what everyone's talking about, which is a return to Judaism. And she says, as a slogan of this return, it sort of turns Jews inwards and seeks us to know ourselves, and become Jewish again. And she thinks this is a mistake. She says that it ignores the world outside of us. It ignores that the problem here is not simply that we didn't know ourselves or that we weren't good enough Jews. It's that there is a world outside of us of which we are part. And the problem there is that that world around us increasingly sees Jews as foreigners, even Jews who are assimilated. And I think this is the this is a point that we've now been talking about for 3 weeks as we are reading this book. And I think it's the depth of her belief in this is important. And I think something we all have to confront in our reading of Arendt, as well as in our own understanding of anti-Semitism. But I think as well as also in our attempts to understand questions of race and assimilation of all different groups today. She says that the Jewish question is only a genuine question or a genuine problem, where large masses of people reside in the midst of another people from whom they are clearly set off by custom, wardrobe, the monopolization of certain professions, and historical developments. So in Poland, the Jewish question was a genuine question, she says. This is on page 44, but because in Poland, the Jews lived separately. They lived in ghettos. They dressed separately. They were a people apart and yet a nation within, and a people within, and a state within. And thus you could have, as she says, in Poland, there's an example of a country with a genuine Jewish question. On the other hand, Spain, she says, is the example of a country with not a genuine Jewish question, because in Spain, you have the emergence of fascism and anti-Semitism with almost no Jews. Germany becomes the country for whom, as she'll say in the anti-Semitism essay, it's sort of like the central country of anti-Semitism, the classic land of anti-Semitism, she calls it, in section 2 on page 60, because Germany has some Jews who set themselves apart, as in Poland, but the vast majority of Jews in Germany are assimilated at this point, or were assimilated when the Nazis rose to power. And this raises what is really the question of anti-Semitism that is so, I think, fascinating in the way Arendt approaches it, and I think unique, is her insistence in understanding modern anti-Semitism, which is the problem she's confronting and she thinks the world is confronting, from medieval or pre-modern anti-Semitism, in the sense that modern anti-Semitism originates not out of Jew hatred, not out of hatred of Jews. It doesn't originate because the Jews are a people apart. In fact, modern assimilation emerges out of, modern anti-Semitism emerges out of assimilated Jewry. It emerges out of in countries in which the Jews are not set apart as a people separate from the rest of the people. It emerges in countries in which the Jews, in much of their lives, are indistinguishable from the rest of the people. And so that raises the problem of why, right? Why does anti-Semitism emerge out of assimilated populations? And Arendt's answer is a very complicated, controversial answer. And there's not one answer. There's a lot. She first says a lot of the things that the reasons we would normally give are not true, right? This idea of an eternal anti-Semitism. It's not that she doesn't think there is, anti-Semitism through history. She does, and she thinks that the historical anti-Semitism and its tropes contribute to the modern, but she doesn't think that that's what causes it, because the anti-Semitism of the present period is different. And also that suggests that there's no way out of it, that it's like, it's fate and it's not anyone's fault. And she thinks it is somebody's fault. It's also not based in the scapegoat theory, right? This idea that these countries needed a scapegoat and the Jews were conveniently there. She doesn't believe that, and she thinks it lets the people who are guilty again off the hook. What she says is, okay, maybe countries needed to blame someone, but why do they blame the Jews? And she tells this story, which I know I've told many times here, and I don't want to keep boring you with it, but of the play in which they're rounding up all the bicyclists, and they keep saying, we have to kill all the bicyclists, we have to kill all the bicyclists. And finally, someone says, why the bicyclists? And someone else says, why the Jews? And the scapegoat theory seems to suggest that the Jews are innocent, and it's just this random selection. And she thinks that that can't be right. That first of all, it simply can't be right, because in order to get all these people to go around and kill the Jews, you have to make an argument. You have to make an argument about the Jews. It's not just random. This doesn't mean she blames the Jews at all. I want to be clear, and we can talk about that. She says, look, this is not the Jews' fault. The Jews, she says that the Jews, this is on 47, are the source of anti-Semitism, is malicious and stupid insight of anti-Semites. Right? So she doesn't believe that. On the other hand, she does believe that there's a reason that the Jews were selected by the Germans. And part of that reason is that the Germans saw themselves as chosen people, and the Jews saw themselves as chosen people. And the Germans saw the Jews as their actual main competition. But the other reason that the Jews are chosen, according to Arendt, is because as the Jews assimilated and as they became indistinguishable from much of German society, both the Germans and the Jews had an interest in maintaining the Jews as a separate people. The Jews had an interest in maintaining themselves as separate people so they could be Jews. And so now, since they were not distinguished by what they wore, or by their law, or by their habits, and they looked and dressed and acted like Germans, the Jews had a problem, which is, if we want to maintain ourselves as Jews, what is a Jew? And she says that what the answer that many Jews came up with was, there's something about us that's Jewish. There's a Jewish substance. There's a kind of essentialism. And the group of Jews that embraced this the most were called Zionists. The idea that there's something about Jews that's different, and that means we're a people apart, and we should have our own land, and we can't live in other places. And so Jews began to say, there's something about being Jewish in its essence, almost racial. That's different. And the Germans, whenever they saw the Jews taking their jobs and causing problems, and whenever there were, social or economic upheavals, wanted to blame the Jews. And so they were very happy to say, yes, they're the Jews, and it's the problem. And so Arendt develops this idea, which I think is first really articulated in this anti-Semitism essay, or this draft of anti-Semitism, that there's something almost special, substantive about being Jewish. So on page 54, right? Or on 50, we'll start on 53 maybe, where she says, all theories that see the Jews' salvation in assimilation are based on the premise of a host people who form a totally united, undifferentiated organism. So if you think that the salvation is going to be assimilation, you base yourself on the fact that you live in another country that's a kind of non-Jewish country. And the goal is to integrate into that country. Jews become German, who are citizens of Jewish faith. The goal is to make Jews vanish, but to hold on to the Jewishness, the first thing you hold on to is simply what she calls the threadbare cloak of religion at the bottom of page 53. The problem is that, especially for Reform Judaism, religion was a threadbare cloak. There wasn't much to it, and it became almost like a mark of identity. And so they cling to religion to preserve a kind of remnant of their Jewishness, she's saying on page 54. And then on the bottom of 54, she says this insight, right, is the Western European point of departure for Herzl's Zionism. Hatred of others becomes a generalized fixation and then is displaced upon a false objective, the Jewish substance. This Jewish substance takes the form of Jews in an anomalous situation and can therefore be expressed anonymously. The ultimate goal of Jewish politics is the normalization of the conditions for the development of the Jewish substance. So Zionism takes up this need of the assimilated Jew to sort of identify themselves as Jewish without religion and without history and without anything else, and says, now we're going to make this the core of our Jewish politics. And this Zionist substance, as she's going to call it again and again in this essay, doesn't have, she has this great line on 55, since Zionism is based in an utterly unhistorical theory, it proves incapable of any real analysis. What this means is Zionism says we're Jews, but there's no historical analysis of what a Jew is, right? A Jew is someone who's a Jew, or a Jew is someone who lives in Israel. And she calls this pseudo-philosophical, right, on page 56. The mad urge to define Jewry, to define Jew, to define Jewish. And it's born out of the failure of assimilation and the need to hold on to something. In Germany, and this now we skip to part 2 of, that's the introduction, in part 2 of this essay. What happened in Germany, since most of the Jews were assimilated, but it wasn't, there were still some Jews who were distinct. It wasn't Spain, but it wasn't Poland. In Germany, you get the theorization of the Jew, both by Jews and by anti-Semites. And so it's in Germany, she says, that the sort of modern ideology of anti-Semitism, this idea that the Jew as a Jew is different and special, and also dangerous, emerges in Germany, and it becomes a principle. The Jew is evil as an evil principle. Emerges as a modern ideology in Germany, she argues here. So she's saying that Germany turns away from the older medieval hatred of Jews because of their religion, their creed, the fact that they didn't like Jesus, the fact that they were moneylenders or usurers. Those were, bad reasons to hate Jews, and they were often false, but they were based in actual historical reality. The new anti-Semitism, as it emerges, she says here, emerges abstracted from any historical reality. And it turns away sharply from the hatred of Jews of the medieval period. And it managed to discover in the Jew, she says, at the end of section 2 on page 65, to discover in the Jew a principle with which to transform the world. Okay, this argument of hers, which I've sketched out, I think is the sort of core of Arendt's thinking about anti-Semitism for much of her life. In a sense, the argument is that in order to save themselves, the Jews, and in order to discriminate against and push the Jews away, the anti-Semites turned Judaism into a race, turned Judaism into a racial principle. Whereas Jews had been a religion, had been a people, but it's at this period in the 19th century and not late 19th, early 20th centuries when this is happening, that hatred of Jews is turned into hatred of the Jew as a race, as a racial category. And Jerry Cohn wrote to me after our discussion last week and said that the thing that I should have said when we were talking about racism and Judaism, and that I didn't, and he's right, is that for Arendt, race is not the beginning of humanity, but its end. Not the origin of peoples, but their decay. Not the natural birth of man, but his unnatural death. In many ways, I take it to be, I don't know if Jerry agrees with this analysis, but that part of what she's arguing here is that the rise of modern anti-Semitism is the end of man. It's the racialization of this question. And that's the sort of core insight that I think Arendt develops in trying to understand this Jewish problem, this Jewish question as it emerged as she's in exile in France in the 1930s. The next 5 sections, which are in this draft essay, bring out a lot of very, extraordinarily exciting at times, disturbing historical detail, and I'm happy to go over it with you. But I think I've happy to stop here for now, and having laid out what I take to be the sort of core points, and respond to those, see what you guys think, and then if you have questions about some of the details in these other chapters, other sections, we can go into them then. Before I do, I know Jerry's here. Jerry, do you want to say anything about any of this question? I know you wanted to get in the last session and couldn't because of your microphone. Do you want to comment on either something from last week or this week? If you're there. Saw him there earlier, but maybe he left. All right, we'll skip that for now. All right, if you'd like to join the conversation, you can either join the chat, which I see is already active. Please be respectful and treat people with the respect you would like to be treated with. You can also raise your hand and engage the conversation. Yana, if there's anything in the chat that you want to bring in, please do. Yana, do you want to say anything before we open it up?
I mean, I'm curious what people think about what she's doing here right now in the anti-Semitism essay. So is and perhaps more generally with her political writings, is she mainly describing a reality? Is that what she's after? Or is she doing something else? Maybe that would be an interesting question to tackle.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll start. Piper, you're up first.
I just had a comment as you were talking and explaining. the white supremacists in the United States kind of feel like the Jews don't belong here. And I think Jews here are very assimilated. Do you see that as kind of similar to what Arendt was getting at? You know, that my feeling is it's not Jews that don't want to be like everyone else. It's everyone else that won't accept it ultimately.
So there's a couple parts to the question. You said, well, the last part is, you said it's not Jews who don't want to be with anyone else, it's other people who won't accept it. And I think there's a way in which that's true. And I think it's, it can be a little different in the United States maybe than in other places. But Jews want to be like everybody else, and yet they want to remain Jews. Now, in Germany, that means Jews want to be Germans, but they also want to be Jews, at least in Germany of the 1920s.
But aren't Germans also other things? They're not just Germans. I mean, they have a religion also, and they abide by that, and they consider that strongly, and their cultural ties that way also. And that's what I see like here also. I don't know that, I think Hannah Arendt is making good points. She's trying to figure out a way to kind of understand what's going on. And things just kind of she's not really talking about all the Jews in the whole world. It's just German Jews. And that's very special because they were so assimilated. I know I'm bringing up a lot. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. So, but it's an important point because, Germany and most European countries in the 1930s were what are called nation states. And a nation state has two parts to it: a nation and a state. A state being a group of people who have equal citizenship and everyone has certain rights under the laws, and a nation being an ethnically or religiously or racially homogenous group of people. Now, none of these nation states were actually ethnically, racially, and religiously homogenous, but they imagined themselves, but they had a dominant group, and that dominant group was the group that had a certain privileged status to which everybody else had to assimilate or integrate in order to be German or French or Slovakian or Polish or whatever it was. Arendt, when she finally came to the United States, was sort of shocked that in the United States, you could be a Polish American, and you could be a German American, and you could be a Jewish American, and she really came to believe that it was totally different from what she had experienced living in Europe. And as such, she came to believe that the United States was the only non-nation state in the world. The only state in which, you came over here and you could exist as a hyphenated American. So there's a few things to say about that. One is, a lot of other states, I think, have become less national states today. I think Germany is actually a good example of a state that's less a nation state today and more like a state in the United States term today, whereas some states have not. And you're seeing, in India, right? There's a big question right now of, can you be an Indian and a Muslim? And in Israel, can you be an Israeli and a Palestinian? And so there are, and a lot of the rise of kind of new nationalism around the world today is emerging out of a desire of many of nation states to reaffirm their national predominance of certain nation state groups. And you're seeing an alliance of, Turkey, India, Israel, Hungary, and a bunch of others of states who want to say it's all right to be a nation state. Another thing to add to that is that Arendt may have very well been wrong about the United States, or at least partly wrong. And I think I've mentioned this before, but one of the criticisms, I think, of her claim that the United States was not a nation state was that while you could have all these different hyphenated identities, it was still a white state, and that people who were not white had a choice of either assimilating to whiteness, as Jews had tried to assimilate to Germanness in Germany, or not. And I think that there's a good argument to be made that at least until the 60s and 70s, and maybe even still today, the United States still had that problem of being a white state. And we can, I think that's a very complicated issue, and we should talk about it if we want. But all of which is to say, I think that Arendt is dealing with real problems in Europe and in Germany around nation states and how people can or cannot assimilate into a state. And her basic thought is that in Europe, in nation states, Jews could not assimilate. It just wouldn't work. She thought it failed. And I know you're and I get your question, Piper. You're saying, look, we succeeded. We did it. I'm not sure that's
but we didn't, because now the white nationalists are saying we don't belong here. Right. I don't know where they want us to go. Okay,
that was the first part of your question. And so let me come back to that. I'd forgotten that. Good. The first part of your question about the white nationalists. So what's interesting about the white nationalists, as I've said a couple times as well, is that their ideology is still largely taken from anti-Semitism. It's an anti-Semitic ideology. It's typically applied against immigrants and Black people and people who are of different colors in the United States. Now, not exclusively. There's still attacks against Jews, and more of them, and we should be never diminish it. But what I would say about the white nationalists and the white supremacists is that their anti-Semitism is really what Arendt here calls the German theoretical anti-Semitism. It's that modern ideology, and they take they take that ideology from that, but then they apply it to different groups in our society. At least that's how I've come to understand what the white supremacists do. She obviously didn't talk about that and study it, so I don't want to speak for her. But so yes, I think you're absolutely right that the white supremacists still embrace anti-Semitism because they see that as the mother of all racisms in some way, that provides the ideological ground for other racisms as well. I hope that helps. Who's next? Max.
Thanks, Roger. So just in thoughts, it's sort of related to the previous question and also related to nationalism and globalism. I've been following the French election with Le Pen and Zemmour against Macron. And Zemmour is a very interesting figure. He talks a lot about reconquest and citing the French writer René Camus, the Great Replacement. And there's another book by Eric Kaufman called White Shift, which is concerns about white demographic decline across the Western world. There was an interesting interview reaction by Judith Butler to Zemmour, where she was saying he's a white supremacist, white nationalist. And I was looking into this Zemmour, and he comes actually he's from Algerian, but he has Jewish and Algerian descent. And so my question is, in them general reflections with this new nationalism and globalism, What do you think would be Arendt's take on the Great Replacement? And also, does the globalism change her reflections on nationalism and the Jewish question?
Oh, okay, these are big questions. I mean, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer all those questions, Max. I mean, I'll say something that I think I can say. One thing which you mentioned, and I think is right, is that Arendt doesn't see nationalism as one of the causes or origins of totalitarianism, right? She thought of the Nazis as non-nationalist people, right? They were internationalists, just like she thought of the Bolsheviks as internationalists. And this is important in her analysis because it's the internationalism of their work, the idea that you have to constantly grow, that allows them to constantly search for new enemies, whereas nationalism confines you to the borders of a nation, and as a result, nationalist movements, in her mind, won't usually become racist. They'll be they may become xenophobic, and to the extent that Jews are seen as foreigners, kick them out. But people who are integrated in are now part of the nation, and everyone is supposed to be equal as part of the nation. And she doesn't see it as a racial, necessarily as a racial category. And so totalitarianism was an internationalist phenomenon, and an imperialist phenomenon, whereas a lot of this modern return to fascism is a nationalist response to an internationalist globalization phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly.
And in that sense, it's not that it's not dangerous in its own way. It can lead to all sorts of bad things, but she doesn't think of it as leading towards the kind of ideological internationalist growth, racial ideologies that we saw that were seen in the 20th century. And so I think that's an important distinction that she pushes us to think about. It doesn't mean that the new nationalism is not problematic or dangerous, but I think you have to be careful in how you frame it. It's not totalitarian. In fact, it's specific and localized. The Great Replacement theory, which you mentioned, and which we've had a number of talks on and panels on and conferences on at Bard at the Arendt Center. We've also had Eric Kaufman speak at the Hannah Arendt Center on his book White Shift. The Great Replacement theory, which says that France is Frenchmen, and we are not. I mean, this is how Camus and others frame it. So I'll just lay it out there, right? We have nothing against Algerians. We have nothing against Muslims. We have nothing against people of color. They should have their own state. But we're French, and we should be able to have our own state, and we should be able to live as French Catholics. And it's discriminatory to say that they can have their state and also our state, right? That's basically Camus' argument. I think the Arendt would find this argument deeply offensive because she doesn't think the French state should be a nation state. She thinks it should be a republic in which all people are citizens, regardless of their race or nationhood or anything else. And so, part of the problem with the Great Replacement theory is that it still imagines the importance of nation states, which Arendt was deeply opposed to. It's also, and yet there's something about it that if you're going to continue to speak in the language of nation state, then it's gonna be hard to argue against it, which is why I think any good Arendtian analysis of these questions has to be consistent in arguing against all nation states, which is one of the reasons, and I'm going to get myself and her into all sorts of trouble these years. I mean, one of the reasons that, she's skeptical of Israel to the extent it claims to be a nation state, right? She was a supporter of Israel. She supported a Jewish state, but she disagreed with the idea that it should be a Jewish state. And the law that was passed about 5 years ago that, finally claimed that Israel is a Jewish state would have been for her it would have been seen as a huge mistake. And I think she's going to be consistent about that, whether she's talking about India and Modi, or whether she's talking about Turkey and the Turks, or Hungary and Orban and his, getting rid of the, unwashed masses, or Trump. Any of these folks who try and bring re-ethnicize, re-racialize, re-religicize, whatever it is, a state into a nation state, are going to run into trouble, because once that happens, there's only a few alternatives. The people who are not of that nationality can assimilate, which we've learned they can't do, and it's also violent. It's not violent, but it means they have to cease being who they are. They can leave, or they can be killed. Those are the three options. Or they can live in the state as second-class citizens. So that's her analysis of those questions. On the bigger stuff and all that, I don't know, but that's what I think I can reliably say from my understanding of her work, what she might say.
Thank you very much. I'm going to check out what the talks that you had. This issue of white shift and ethnicity and identity, and in the Great Replacement, or this white shift, this sort of this image of we're fighting for our survival is the feeling. It just sort of throws up so many really emotional questions and issues to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I mean, I don't know all of Eric Kaufman's work, but I will say that at least part of his argument is that it's wrong to think of white as a racial or as a settled category, and that part of the reason he's arguing that whiteness continues to persist is because people who are not white keep being brought into whiteness. At least that's my understanding of his argument. And that, whiteness can include not only Poles and Irish, but Jews, and in his reading, even Hispanics and Blacks. It becomes divorced of its color and its race, and more of an idea. At least that's how I think I understand his work, but I may have it wrong. It's been a while since I've looked at it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Alex, are you there?
Sorry, I was on mute. Roger, what is the consequence of racialization? Does it just make anti-Semitism another generic form of prejudice without any kind of historical background? Or that's what I was a little bit puzzled about.
I think it's what's the consequence of racialization? Um,
Or does it make it easier?
so
Does it make it easier
Alex,
for
you're breaking up, so I'm just gonna answer.
people to act in an, okay, sorry.
Yeah. So one consequence of it is that we imagine that all Jews are the same, right? That there's this substance that makes us Jewish. I mean, this is an argument that many people in the Black community are making today. A lot of the contrarian Black thinkers, right, are, you know, that there's a lot of different ways to be Black, and there's a lot of different ways to be Jewish, and there's a lot of different ways to be Polish. And when you have to maintain being Jewish because you want Judaism to continue and it's part of your identity, and yet it's not a class, and it's not a people, and it's not a religion, what makes you Jewish? And so it sort of creates this kind of magical, pseudo philosophical, pseudo mystical spirit that we have to somehow embrace as Jews. What Barbara Fields in another context will call racecraft, but here you would have Jewcraft, in that sense. Another consequence is that you abandon what Hannah Arendt always through her life calls real historical analysis, the context, right? You stop talking about, well, the fact that there's rich Jews and poor Jews, and there's middle-class bourgeois Jews, and then there's Western Jews and Eastern Jews. So one of the things she mentions in this essay, Anti-Semitism, I don't know how many of you know about it or caught it, was the Palestine transfer agreement, right? Which happened in, I think, 38? Someone probably knows this better than me. But 60,000 Jews from Germany were allowed to, the Zionists in Palestine and Germany negotiated with the Nazis to allow 60,000 German Jews to escape to Palestine, and paid for them, paid for their release, but not Polish Jews or not Eastern Jews. And so, what Arendt says is, look, if all you care about is saving the Jewish spirit, right, you'll do anything. You'll negotiate with the Nazis. You'll save the rich Jews. You'll save this. You'll save that. It doesn't really matter. And we are unable to be critical of it because we're saving the Jews, as if all Jews are the same. And, she's very critical of this. And it's one of the reasons she was so critical of some of the Judenräte, right? Who again negotiated with Eichmann and others to save some Jews and not others. And in her view, this is a consequence of the racialization of the idea that we have to save the Jews, as if the Jews exist, that the Jews are something, rather than looking at, which Jews are being saved, right? You lose your critical analysis because you're just caught up in this mysticism of the Jews. So those are some consequences of this racialization. On the other side, you have the anti-Semitic consequences of it, which is that no matter what a Jew does, they're always a Jew. No matter how assimilated they are, no matter how educated or how white or Protestant they act, they're always a Jew. And that allows for both social and eventually even political discrimination, even in the most assimilated scenarios. So those are a few different consequences, as I understand it, that she offers of what I've called racialization. let me say that this is not the part of Arendt I know best. If there are people here who, you know, want to jump in, and I'm happy to hear other views. These are difficult intellectual questions, but they're also just difficult things to talk about. Let's be honest. And one of the reasons I appreciate reading and teaching these parts of Arendt is because they give us a way to talk about things that are often not talked about. But I don't want to in any way claim that, you know, this is my area of expertise. It's not. You know, I'm happy to have people, if there's mistakes or if you think there's things that need to be said, I'm happy to have people jump in. George, I see half your face, but there you are.
Yes, I think I have a question for you that maybe you want to discuss. You mentioned the historical aspect and the Great Replacement theory. And basically what's happened is the nation is back in vogue nowadays. And so is the Great Replacement theory. And when we're speaking about, let's say, white nationalism in the United States, it's not just white racial nationalism, it's white Christian rationalism, which brings to mind for me the political theology that she doesn't seem to be discussing here. For instance, the great debate between Jacob Taubes and Carl Schmitt that really deals with this aspect from an old political theological aspect of St. Paul, and whether he's the apostle to the Christians and why that's why the Christians hate Jews, etc., etc. Now, if somebody wants to discuss that aspect of it, I'd really like to hear it, because it doesn't come into it. We're speaking basically either on a Jewish anti-Semitic thing or on a racial thing, where it could be both together.
Yeah. I mean, Taube is fascinating. Whenever I've read him, I've always been fascinated, but I am not in any way right now prepared to talk about Taube. Jakob Taube was a brilliant theologian. And Arendt doesn't really cite him, so I don't know how to. If someone else wants to answer that or take a stab at it, be my guest, but that's beyond my abilities right now. I mean, is it, yeah. Do you want to say more about it, George? Because I just don't know.
The thing that comes up there and that made me think about of the Great Replacement theory and the white Christian is that one of the things in Germany that's a little unique to Germany is Martin Luther. And what he brought in is, and again, this particular aspect of it is that, you know, Christianity started with St. Paul. And was St. Paul still Jewish when he started it? Or did he give up and just become a Gentile like the others? And Taube is saying he was still Jewish, and because of being still Jewish, he wanted to include the Jews in the Messianism, that's the Christian Messianism, whereas Carl Schmitt said no.
Right.
The whole big difference is that the Jewish Messiah is not here yet, Christian Messiah is, and that's the great enmity between the people.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's okay. That's interesting. I just don't know what else to say about it. I'm not in.
All right, I really just wanted to bring that up as an interesting point.
I appreciate it.
Yes.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Jeff.
Oh, actually, yeah, you're doing a great job. You're right in the area that I was most interested in. I'm just, you know, I'm always interested in the philosophical angle of, or mostly. Page 64 has got that great paragraph about noxiousness, where basically, you know, she turns the abstraction on its head, or rather, the modern anti-Semites did. I really love that paragraph because it's like it's a thicker way of looking at essentialism, right? It's like instead of just having it be concepts, it's here now. It's an example of a whole people. My question is right in the very next page, which is the very closing sentences of section 2. But rather long before putting any of this practical use to practical use, Germany, with what might be called total disinterest, expounded modern abstract anti-Semitism most radically and consistently. But that reference to total disinterest, am I imagining things, or is that a Kant reference, which then opens it up to something that all of us have read just about, which is her Arendt's attribution of a political philosophy to Kant. But this idea of total disinterest it comes up in the critiques over and over and over again, right? Basically, you have to find the pure something. He's always talking about finding the pure example of something. And the way you get there is by affecting total disinterest. So I was wondering if you could sort of thicken that connection for us, if that's not too much.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, let's read the paragraph that you like so much to begin with, because it's a great paragraph, and I'm glad you brought us back to the text, which I always appreciate. Jews and all their concrete noxiousness are to be overlooked for the sake of the Jew, right? So for the sake of this abstraction, the Jew, we overlook any noxiousness in Jews, especially poor or, people who stand out. So Jews and all their concrete noxiousness are to be overlooked for the sake of the Jew, whose oppression is a disgrace to mankind.
Are you gone?
The issue was turned into such an abstraction because there was such unanimity as to the Jewish noxiousness. Modern anti-Semitism, which knows that Jews are not universally noxious, turns this abstraction on its head by overlooking decent Jews with whom one may be personally acquainted. There are decent Jews as well, in favor of the Jew, who has at last been discovered to be the evil principle of history. The classic form in which the Jewish question was posed in the Enlightenment provides classic anti-Semitism its theoretical basis. So, modern anti-Semitism knows that Jews are not noxious because they're assimilated. And it knows many good, decent Jews, many of whom we like and are our friends. And so what it has to do is turn it around and say, yeah, there are a lot of good Jews, decent Jews, but they're all still the Jew. They're still Jewish. And the Jew, is the theoretical basis of classic anti-Semitism. As the next sentence says, to transform the Jew from a living individual into a principle, into an agglomeration of characteristics that are universally evil. And although observable in other people as well, are always simply called Jewish, right? So it's not only Jews who have a big nose or who might be, like money or whatever it is, but we call them Jewish, whether you're Jewish or not. And so we transform the Jew into the Jew and then conjure up all things that are Jewish about him. Then to go to the second part of what you read, that Germany did not become the classic land of anti-Semitism because of Hitler, or even because a few Jews have been beaten to death. What made Germany the sort of font of modern anti-Semitism was not that some Jews were killed, because Jews have been killed for a long time all over the world. So have other people. What made it anti-Semitic was that before putting any of this, the Jew, into practical use, this principle of evil, they could radically and consistent propound this doctrine with what we call disinterest. And you're saying, is disinterest a kind of Kantian aesthetic judgment? No, I don't think she's talking about Kant here. I think she's saying that many of the people who developed this idea of the Jew, of Jewishness, we're not actually doing it within a context of economic or historical struggle or economic or historical argument. They were doing it caught up in a kind of theoretical effort to identify Jews. Jews were doing it because they wanted to remain Jewish, even though they were less and less Jewish. And anti-Semites were doing it because they wanted to keep the Jews apart, even though the Jews were increasingly less apart. Now, there is an interest there. And so, you know, I don't know what the idea that it's with total disinterest. I don't know exactly how to read that. I'll say that. But I don't think it's a Kantian claim. I think it's more that it became almost like a theoretical game or exercise. That's how I read it, but I don't have full confidence in that. But I don't think it's Kantian.
But yeah, that actually helped quite a bit. It fits up to other ideas I have, which I'll keep to myself. But yeah, that makes sense. It probably should say it's sort of an affectation of total disinterest. There are interests, but I think the essentializing is basically covering that up. Thank you.
I think that's right. Hannah. Hannah, you got to unmute.
Oh, I just had a question for you, but in my demented mind, it went out of my mind. I'm sorry, but you know, I just feel like I feel that she obfuscates as much as she explains about anti-Semitism in certain ways. I mean, I really got a lot out of her discussion of assimilation. That was helpful, but and I think her discussion of Zionism in this draft is overwrought and actually wrong. Her attributing to, you know, Herzl wasn't saying that he was just saying that we need a political state. We need political power. We're not going to get away from anti-Semitism unless we have the ability to have our own land. He wasn't saying all the things that she said he was saying. I don't, from my reading of it. So I found her prescient on, and I wanted to ask you this. It seemed like she was foreseeing, or however you say that, foretelling the European Union in a way. Do you think that's true? That I found very prescient, that she was suggesting there basically should be what there is now, which is a European Union. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, in the sense that Arendt is one of a number of political and cultural thinkers who around the war and post-war era argue that we need to abandon the nation state idea. Right. And one of her one way she thinks of it is through the United States, right? And another is through what she calls these federalist, right, these federal principles. And by the way, those go together, because I think in her analysis of the United States in the book on revolution, at the core of it, she thinks that the idea that most saved and makes the United States, in her mind, different in a meaningfully, in a good way, is the idea of federalism. Mm-hmm. So she believed that the best way to approach the Israeli-Palestinian problem was to create a binational state, not a federal binational state.
Right. Yeah, I know that.
And we'll talk, and we'll actually read a number of her proposals for that in this book as we go forward. Similarly, she thought that in areas of the world where there were different nationalities or races or ethnicities, the best way to deal with it would be to create a secular Republican, small r Republican state, and have different federal republics that were more national within
Right.
them.
Right.
So yes, there's that idea. It's not hers alone. I would never claim that for it, but she was a proponent of that idea. And it's one of the ideas that I think in some ways underlied some parts of the European Union.
So again, as I said last week, thank you for that. As I said so this is a very difficult thing to read. I'm dying. I started reading anti-Semitism in the beginning of The Origins of Totalitarianism, because I'm dying to see what kind of evolution there is in that essay. Is it huge, the difference between this draft and in totality? Because it seems at the beginning of reading it that there's a lot different.
Yeah, I mean, Arendt is, at the time she's writing this,
The Jews haven't really been killed yet en masse.
yeah, I'm just trying to think. So she's 32 years old. She spent the last 6 years living as a refugee, exile, and stateless person in France. She's doing a little research in the French library. She doesn't exactly have access to a library or such, or her books. I think it's astounding what she's been able to put together here in 1930 as an exile in France. But yes, I mean, when you read the anti-Semitism chapters in the Origins, it's much more conceptually thought through and argued. A lot of the facts and a lot of the stories are actually going to come back, but they're going to be more they're going to be told in a more I don't want to say coherent. What do I want to say? A more meaningfully directed way to make an argument. But I think the basics of it are, a lot of it is here. She'll talk less about Zionism, which, and one of the things that we'll see as we go through this is that Arendt has wildly changing opinions of Zionism.
Yes.
Throughout her life. She's here. She's critical of Zionists. There comes a period where she becomes more involved in Zionist circles.
Right.
And then she'll turn against Zionism with the essay Zionism Reconsidered, which we'll read later in the book. And, maybe one of the most important essays in this book.
In this draft, I just feel once again that while there is lots of sort of philosophical kind of attempts at analysis of anti-Semitism and historical, I suppose, just not enough religious analysis, not enough religious analysis to get at the origins and the persistence of anti-Semitism, or of enmity between all kinds of different religions, not just anti-Semitism. And I just, this is one of the hardest essays I've ever read, actually, just keeping up with the terminology and with the substance versus blah, blah, blah. But thus far, it's some great insights, others real obfuscation and lack of clarity about just what it is, anti-Semitism. So thank you.
Yeah, no, and I'll just say, Arendt, part of the analysis here, right, is that medieval and ancient anti-Semitism was largely religiously based. It was, a lot of it was anger and hatred of the Jews for not denying Christ.
Right.
And also for willingness to handle money and usury. What she's saying is, in the 19th century, those religious reasons for anti-Semitism have disappeared. Those are not the reasons. And if you can't find the reasons for modern anti-Semitism in that. Some of the tropes, right? The money lender, the Shylock, the capitalism, whatever, they come back. And she has, we haven't really talked about it, but there's the there's sort of the section where she talks about on pages 68 to 69, where she tries to distinguish medieval hatred of the Jews and modern anti-Semitism. And, part of the, I didn't mention this before, so let me take the opportunity, if you don't mind, Hannah, and talk about it now. She says that on page 68, near the bottom, second to last paragraph, the unadulterable historical basis for the hatred of Jews in the Middle Ages lies in the stiff-necked opposition of the Jews to Christ. And the equally unadulterable social basis lies in the role Jews played in commerce and banking. So in the Middle Ages, there was a reason, doesn't mean it's a good reason, right? But there was a reason that Christians hated Jews. They denied Christ and they were involved in banking and things that the Christians thought were wrong. But in the modern era, she says, those associations fall apart. They become arbitrary. And so she says such modern arbitrariness in the next paragraph begins with the definition of the Jew. Since the Jew no longer has an indisputable identity in Western European nations, one of the anti-Semites' most urgent needs is to define him. Whether the Jews are a religion or a nation, a people, a race, a state, or a tribe depends on the specific opinion non-Jews have about themselves. But it certainly has no connection whatever with any germinal knowledge about the Jews.
This is very important because I didn't get this far. So in fact, she does address it, and I'm sorry. I did not get this far in the essay. So thank you.
Okay.
Keep going. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. What she then says is, that there's a holdover, that a lot of modern anti-Semitism holds over some of these old tropes, right? Of ritual murder. In the next paragraph on page 69, in comparison to such nonsensical foolishness, even medieval definitions were closer to the reality of Jews of the period. So ritual murder was a lie, but the religious hatred that lay behind it was genuine.
Yeah.
It was a lie that all Jews are usurers, but to the extent that Jews came into social contact with Christians and other people, they came in contact with them as usurers.
Right.
But so there was actually historical context for the hatred of Jews in the medieval period. But the modern anti-Semite never actually doesn't even know what a Jew is. And they encounter a Jew, they encounter someone who looks like themselves. And so they need to make up what the Jew is. And it's kind of arbitrary. And now here's the side kicker, right? The assimilationists and the Zionists both also feel a need to say who the Jew is in an arbitrary way, because they're disconnected from their history and their religion. And so, this is the difficult part of Arendt, right?
Yes.
Both the Jews and the anti-Semites had a common interest in figuring out who the Jew was. And they did so for very different reasons. And you don't blame the Jews for doing it. And you don't blame the Jews for what then came. But what Arendt is saying is there's a mistake they both made. That's a kind of intellectual, ironic distance that some people find very offensive or hard to take, right? I understand that. And I know it's a criticism that's been made of Arendt in many different parts of her work around, she's too out in the clouds, she's too intellectual, whatever. And and there's sometimes you can say that's true, but she's making a point here that anti-Semitism in its modern form could not have happened if we hadn't developed this idea of the Jew. And that Jews had an interest in developing the idea of the Jew just as anti-Semites did. I think you can say that today about race as well. And I think that's one of the interesting provocative things of helping to think about her work.
Very, very helpful. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. I did not get that far, as I said, and because it's such a difficult read, so I have to keep going.
I do apologize. We try and keep the reading to a certain minimum, because I realize you guys are all busy and these are hard, but this book is really long. And if we don't, if I broke this essay up into 2 or 3 parts, we would just never finish it. So
Right.
I do realize it's long, and I understand some people can't finish it. So I apologize. Bella, you're up.
And just have some notes about this work. And right now I can understand Solzhenitsyn 200 years together, Solzhenitsyn's book. Because without Hannah Arendt, anti-Semitism, I couldn't understand it. I couldn't visualize it. Her talent in writing is quite well. And I want to say, just in Russian language, relationships very difficult, complicated relationship between Russians and Jewish people, illustrated in reflected in our language. We all know Shabbat, what it is. What is this, right? Shabbat. So when we want to wish each other a good weekend, in the other way, we're telling Shabbat Shalom. But in Russian, we have interesting, absolutely different sense in one word, shabash. Shabash and shabash, different word press in different syllables, but it's very different sense between these 2 words. Shabash meaning the end of work. Furthermore, it's about the work for extra money, for example. Something for stricter, right? But Shabash is about the meeting of witches. It's like Walpurgis night. You can see very different, very complicated meanings of these 2 words. And I want to say, in our literature, in our anecdotes, we also meeting every time we can see the role of Jews as a trickster.
As a what?
As a trickster.
Trickster, yeah.
No hero, never Jewish people never been a hero.
Yeah.
Even in literature, not only in folklore, for example, right?
Yeah.
And right now I want to say, finally, my eyes was open when I could start anti-Semitism and Hannah Arendt, because I can visualize these myths, and I can, furthermore, we can, this Jewish question somehow reflects in my mind with the current war, because we can, but today we can visualize much more, because we have social media, we can see not only TV, right? So we can see photos, pictures, and video on YouTube and other platforms. So that's my news.
Thank you, Bella. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Just to say, I have been, at times, people have approached me and wanting to do a conference on Arendt and Solzhenitsyn. and it's an interest I have. I've always really loved, but I don't know his work well at all. But it does strike me that there's something to be said and done by bringing Solzhenitsyn and Arendt together. So thank you
Yes,
for bringing
but,
that out. I'm glad
it-
this helped you read Solzhenitsyn. So
yes,
but
of course, in the very beginning of 2000s of
Yeah.
our century.
yeah. So we're getting low on time, but Arkawan and Vivian, why don't you both say something, try and keep it brief, and then we'll and I'll see if I have time to answer a little bit.
Roger, I have a question for Jana, actually. I'd like to come back to Jana, who started out in a way, who said, you know, who made a point about what it is that Arendt was doing or saying with this. In other words, I mean, I don't know, Jana, if you think I'm wrong in thinking of a meta text here, but a meta text is what interests me here all along when we read Hannah, because she is saying something. So, and I am not, I can't possibly formulate what it is she's saying. I just have feelings about it. But I'd be very interested to hear, Jana, what you think Hannah is doing and saying with this.
So I'm going to let Jana answer that, but I first want to also just make sure we get Arkawan's question in, and then Jana will answer it.
Thank you so much. So while just listening to all these nice arguments and discussions and nice, not arguments, I just like have a question about, so when Arendt says that there's a mistake being made by both sides, even Jews, by raising the idea that they are Jews or they are Jewish. So that's just like take me to the question that isn't that the same that as, for example, Turks in Turkey says that Kurds are not exist, or we are allowed to do all the things that we do against them because they are saying we are Kurds. So they even not allowed to mention that, they have to say we are Turks. So is Anna like Hannah accused Jews of that they shouldn't raise that quest or Jewish question or their identity? I just like to understand that a little bit more. And the other question is,
let's keep it one. We're short on time. I apologize.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to let Jana go first, and then I'll answer yours.
Yeah. So I think there's sort of like two considerations. One is, what do we do with Hannah Arendt's writings, right? Which is a question somewhat separate from her intentions. And then the other question is about, like, why is she writing in the way that she's writing? And I find it generally not the most productive approach to say, I mean, it's important to discuss whether she's right or wrong, but I think that can only go so far, given that from my understanding of the text, my engagement with the text, she's not only describing a historical reality. So if we only engage on the level of, is she right here or is she wrong there, and how is she right and how is she wrong, then we miss part of what she's actually doing, which is not trying to sort of like mimetically reflect a given reality of history, but making an intervention in history, perhaps. So I find it helpful to think of what she's doing as in a way, politics in action itself too. So despite the sort of like emphasis she puts throughout her life on the distinction between thinking and action, I do think there is in the tone that she brings in, what we've also been sort of like grappling with, the ironies, the sarcasm, the paradoxes, right? That is a kind of pluralistic element. That is an element from politics, right? That is an element from sort of like that only works in the engagement that I have with you, or that you have with the text, right? Like there she's directly appealing to the reader, and we can't just sort of like I mean, one thing that we can do is explain it away and say, well, the irony is just obfuscation, right? But I don't think that's explaining the irony. So what do we do with the irony? What do we do with the sarcasm? I think the sarcasm is, those are points where we can say, here, she's not just provoking us, she's not just sort of like trying to obscure her argument. That irony is politically meaningful. So that's what I would say about that.
I think that's great. Thank you, Jana. You know, and the irony, which is part of her work throughout, is part of her attempt to deal with these questions. It's somewhat self-defense, but I think, thanks, Jana. On the question that of you know, saying that both sides are wrong, is there's a kind of both sidesism and what else to do. I mean, what Arendt is saying here is that if Jews want to create a politics in the 1930s, as far as I understand these essays, they should create a politics that's alive to the context. So there are rich Jews and poor Jews, and there are professional Jews and there are laboring Jews. And the idea is not that there's a Jew and there's a German. There's also rich Germans and poor Germans and professional Germans and laboring Germans and all sorts of others. And she thinks that the desire to put everything in one basket of the Jew versus the German, to racialize it, to come back to that idea, is a mistake. That doesn't mean you ignore the fact that there are Jewish professionals and Jewish laborers. But it does mean that you have to be more politically alive to the fact that we're not just Jews or just Kurds or just Turks. That's how I would understand what her political critique that's going on in this era. All right, thank you all. Thank you for reading a very difficult essay, talking about difficult themes, and doing it really well. The next essay we're reading on the minority question is a really good one. And I think Jana's going to lead you through it next week. So that's a treat. And I look forward to seeing how that goes and participating. But thank you all. Continue reading, enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you very soon.